and welcome to the next chapter of the Filmgoer's Guide to God by Tim Cawkwell. Last week we looked at violence. The films were The Samurai, Brighton Rock and The Funeral. This week the subject is Guilty as Sin, and the films are Pickpocket, Hardcore and American Gigolo. So, and we begin from Shakespeare's King Lear, Act 5, Scene 3. Come, let's away to prison, we two alone will sing like birds in a cage, or however it's pronounced, I''th''. Three stories. Firstly, a student murders two women and then is gradually overwhelmed with such anguish that he is finally compelled to confess his guilt. When he is sent into penal servitude, the young girl with whom he has fallen in love follows him there and rescues him. The second story is of a pickpocket who, having learnt and mastered the tricks of the trade, then decides to go straight in order to help a young unmarried woman with a child to bring up. At this point he is caught in a police trap and arrested. Sent to prison, he is saved by the young woman who continues to visit him in prison. The third is of a male prostitute who in his cruising encounters the wife of a politician. She falls in love with him, and at the same time he finds himself being framed for murder and found guilty. Sent to prison, the woman visits him in prison and sets in motion a legal process to free him. A common thread to all three stories is a cat and mouse game between the main character and an inspector of police. As they keep crossing each other's paths, the latter tries to trap his victim, who tries disdainfully to fend off his pursuer, bolstering himself with a theory about the right of certain individuals to live beyond the law. Finally, all the stories are clearly located by their authors in the big city, respectively St. Petersburg in Russia, Paris in France, and Los Angeles in the USA. One novel and two films. Crime and Punishment, 1865-6, Pickpocket, 1959, and American Gigolo, 1980. So Crime and Punishment is likely the Pickpocket one. Three authors: Fyodor Dostoevsky, Robert Bresson and Paul Schrader. Three stories with one theme of sin and redemption through love. Central to the three is the young woman for whom the hero falls, almost in spite of himself, and who achieves his salvation from crime and sin. The fountainhead of this religious parable is Dostoevsky, 1821-81. The Russian socialist, that's 1881, the Russian socialist who, following a narrow escape from execution by firing squad, spent 8 years in penal servitude in Siberia. It was his experience in prison that awoke in him a religious faith, and when he returned to live in European Russia, his nationalism manifested itself in a belief in the need for a religious reawakening. Crime and Punishment is famous for the psychological realism of Raskolnikov's motivations and anxieties after the murder of the old pawnbroker and her sister, but it is equally remarkable for its story of redemption. After Raskolnikov is sent to Siberia, the meek Sonia follows him there to wait for his release. His emptiness turns to understanding and love. The rights and wrongs of murder are transcended by an unexpected capacity for human goodness. Robert Bresson, 1907 to 1999, whom we have encountered as the director of Diary of a Country Priest, was born in rural France but educated in Paris. His first wish was to become a painter, but in the 1930s he began to write film scripts. It was not until the age of 36 that he began making his first feature-length film, Angels of the Streets, which gave an early indication of his obsession with human suffering and sin and with divine salvation. Like a sculptor who cuts and chips away waste material to reveal form, Bresson created a series of perfectly carved films, reducing his stories to a sequence of necessary images, 13 in all, between 1943 and 1983. His influences were intellectual rather than cinematic, and indeed his style evolved in opposition to the common features of American and European cinema: the star system, big budgets, heavy sentiments. There is a remarkable symmetry to his career. Up to his midpoint film, O Hassad Balthazar, he made 6 feature films about protagonists in claustrophobic settings, including the 3 that form his prison cycle: A Man Escaped, Pickpocket, The Trial of Joan of Arc, one set in a convent, Angels of the Streets, and one in the closed world of bourgeois society, The Ladies of the Bois de Boulogne. As we have already seen, the rural parish of Diary of a Country Priest itself creates an enclosed world. All 6 films are stories of salvation, which breaks out at the end of each film, following their heroes and heroines to achieve a release from spiritual imprisonment. When Bresson came to make his 7th feature, Au Hassad Balthazar, in 1966, close to the middle of his 40-year career as a film director, he distilled his intellectual influences to shape a story about the life of a donkey from birth to death. The perfect Bresson protagonist, an archetype for the mute, earthly, suffering creatures in his films, who carry within their persons a spiritual quality. What triggered the story in Bresson's mind was a lightning vision of a film with a donkey as its central character. Dumb in the sense of being deprived of speech, and supposedly dumb in the sense of stupid, but in fact endowed with intelligence, wonderfully photogenic in the head, and important into the film its 15 minutes of fame as the beast on which the Holy Family fled to Egypt and on which Jesus entered Jerusalem in triumph. The film is pivotal to Bresson's career because it presented in its purest form his ideas of how one person can redeem another. In this case, the donkey is a Christ figure bearing patiently the afflictions of the world. It ends with the wounded animal lying down to die, surrounded by a flock of sheep, pastoral, peaceable, and serene, with the alpine bells on the sheep's necks tinkling a requiem. After that apotheosis come another 6 films in which Bresson's austere view of the world threatens to be overwhelmed by pessimism, a world of faith evacuated of hope and love. The act of suicide remains an obsession, taking darker forms still. Redemption becomes more mechanical, as though even the sentiment inherent in the concept must be jettisoned. When he made his final masterpiece, Money, in 1983, about the corrosive effects of money, chief catalyst of human sin, the innocent Yvonne, brought to prison by the transgressions of others, is deserted there by his wife Elise, in a wilful inversion of the situation in Pickpocket, where Jeanne, or Sonia, remains faithful to Mikhail Raskolnikov, even when he is sent to prison. Towards the end of the film, Yvonne performs a series of axe murders as though he were a Raskolnikov gone to the bad. Then, right at the end, he performs the confessional act by turning himself into the police, a procedure which Bresson films in mechanical middle distance, shorn of all hint of emotion. Compare the way Raskolnikov screws up his courage to go to the police station for 500 pages. The third auteur, Paul Schrader, was born in 1946 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, USA, and brought up in the community of the Dutch Reformed Church. Forbidden films and TV as a child, he saw his first film at the age of 17. He then embarked on a turbulent student career in intellectual rebellion against his father, his upbringing, and his country. At Calvin College, he took up journalism, reviewing films and being radicalized by the movement against the Vietnam War while he studied Calvin, Buber, Heidegger, and others. In 1968, he went to film school at the University of California and crystallized his ambitions to be a film critic. It is striking that his intellectual revolt did not bring down the guillotine on his religion. He turned his back on the church as an institution, but his best reviewing focused on the way film could be a medium for spiritual ideas, a period which culminated in 1972 in the publication of transcendental style in film, Ozu Bresson Dreher, an idiosyncratic book from which we learn as much about the author's preoccupations as about the free filmmakers he examines. Among the ideas he formulates is one of how the transcendental film moves from abundance to stasis. This occurs when it achieves the release for the main character from a set of circumstances. The audience, carefully channeled and nurtured to this point, experience the moment as one of transcendence. This religious drive in his critical writings then metamorphosed into a creative one. He had already tried his hand at script writing, and in the summer of 1972 wrote the script for Taxi Driver, filmed by Martin Scorsese in 1975, which marked publicly Schrader's vision of a sinful world waiting to be redeemed. His Christ figure is the unlikely Travis Bickle, a taxi driver whose contact with all the scum of New York in the back seat of his car drives him to a revenge which turns into an act of redemption. He kills the men exploiting Iris, the teenage prostitute, and shocks her into returning to her family, in effect into salvation from sin. This idea of two Americas, one upright and acutely conscious of right and wrong, the other permissive enough to allow prostitution and pornography to flourish, indifferent to the very idea of sin, continued to grip Schrader, and led him in his second feature, Hardcore, to concoct a story which could illustrate this idea in as stark a manner as possible. It tells of a family in the Dutch Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, whose daughter, on a church youth camp in California, absconds and finds herself taking part in pornographic films. The father, Jake Van Dorn, is then obliged to leave the security of his community and go to California to look for his daughter, a land whose milk and honey have become the fruits of hedonism. Coming face to face with the intricacies of the sex industry, he enlists the help of Nikki, who is performing at a club called Les Girls, advertising a live nude in order to find his daughter. In one potent scene at the airport, Jake and Nikki discuss religion. Nikki happily admits to membership of the Venusian Church, and when Jake expounds a pure Calvinism, I believe in tulip, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints, Nikki shrewdly asks, "Before you can become saved, God knows who you are," to which Jake replies that he would not be God if he did not know the names of those who will be saved. Nikki responds with scorn, "It's all worked out, fixed, and I thought I was messed up." She is not on this line of reasoning about to give up the Venusian Church. The film, which contains echoes of the morality of the Western and of the private eye movie in its portrayal of the hero resolving his crisis outside the law by using his own strength, physical and mental, descends into violence, with Schrader disturbing his liberal audience by hinting at the darkest side of pornography. Murder can be filmed as a means to sexual gratification. The film needs a bleak ending to match the bleakness of his vision. A reworking of the parable of the prodigal son, in which the son resists the father's act of forgiveness. Instead, Schrader seeks to create a transcendent moment. At first, his daughter, resists Jake's decision to take her back home, but she succumbs when he says to her, "You take me home." Yet we sense that no reconciliation has occurred, and furthermore, when he abandons Nikki to the streets, he doubles our repugnance. The moment of stasis is empty. It is this delicate idea of final reconciliation that Schrader strives to bring to life in his next film, American Gigolo, which, like Hardcore, is from his own screenplay. Hardcore has the virtue of an autobiographical film, an intense telling of Schrader's move from the Dutch Reformed Church to a free life in California, but also the vice that he fails to find an imaginative way to resolve the story. What gives Crime and Punishment a universality is the vulnerability of the murderer, Raskolnikov. In Hardcore, Jake Van Dorn is a loner who resorts to the fist and the gun to make his own law. The main character, therefore, imposes a resolution to the story instead of it overwhelming him unexpectedly. For American Gigolo, Schrader created a central character who, like his forerunners, Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, and, as we shall see, Michael in Pickpocket, believes with seeming confidence that he can exercise his will to create the outcome he seeks, but in reality is prey to far larger forces shaping his destiny. When Julian Kay, named after Kafka's Joseph K. in The Trial, steps from self-absorption and turpitude onto the path of salvation, when he experiences the epiphany of the loveless boy redeemed by love, Schrader achieves a more satisfying ending than in Hardcore. The film marks his coming of age as a director. So, free authors and free stories, free crimes and free criminals. Raskolnikov's crime is specific, premeditated murder, not just of the superfluous pawnbroker, but of her innocent sister, Lizaveta, as well. The act is described in brutal detail. In Pickpocket, on the other hand, Mikhail's criminal activity is petty, even though at points it achieves heights of poetry. His pickings are poor at first, but once he joins up with two other professionals, sharpens his technique and perfects his training, the ballet of hands in motion which Bresson choreographs to show the three pickpockets at work in the Gare de Lyon is a justly celebrated sequence. Endowing these thieves, or at least their hands, with a grace that seems divine in origin, the booty of the means justifying the criminal ends. For a brief moment, in American Gigolo, Schrader echoes this in the shots of love-making, adding an extra dimension to a gratificatory scene. When Julian makes love to Michelle for the second time, the scene is filmed as a series of deliberate and sensuous limb movements. It echoes not just the pickpocketing in Pickpocket, but the cool and clinical sex sequence Jean-Luc Godard filmed in A Married Woman. Since Godard was brought up in Geneva, John Calvin's city, the two sex scenes could be considered to constitute a Calvinist sex manual. That's a weird thing to say. These are surfaces. The internal state of mind in all three stories is more significant. Raskolnikov's brain mixes up a burning desire to confess his crime, a philosophical defence of why the pawnbroker did not deserve to live, and a compassion for the predicament of Marmeladov's family. He, drunk and jobless, his wife Katerina Ivanovna, consumptive, and Sonia, the daughter driven to prostitution to support the family and its three young children. In Pickpocket, Mikhail's circumstances are less confused. He does not want to work nor look after his dying mother and turns to petty crime, less as a means of survival than because pickpocketing is the only activity to arouse his interest, a sort of drift towards damnation. In American Gigolo, Julian's activity is within the law, but his prostitution is a triumph of body over soul, matter over spirit, and lovelessness over love. When he is caught up in the inquiry into the murdering, vicious circumstances of a crime for which he is framed, but for which, near the end, it is specifically explained he did not commit, the detective, called Detective Sunday in honour of the moral majority, pronounces him guilty as sin in Calvinist judgment on the conduct of Julian's life. He has damned himself already. So, free criminals and free policemen. The cat and mouse game played between them is cast in American Gigolo as the conflict of righteousness and sin, in addition to which Schrader hints at another conflict between human and some other kind of law. Sunday. Doesn't it ever bother you what you do? Julian. Giving pleasure to women? Am I supposed to feel guilty about that? Sunday. But it's not legal. Julian. Legal is not always right. Men make laws. Sometimes they're wrong, stupid, or jealous. Sunday. Do you know better? Julian. Some people are above the law. Sunday. How do these people know who they are? Julian. They know. They ask themselves. Despite a feeling in the spectator that Julian is getting out of his depth philosophically, rather like Nicky at the airport in Hardcore, Schrader is honouring the pedigree of Julian's predecessors. When Michael meets the inspector in Pickpocket, he argues for those people, intelligent with talent, even genius, whose consciences select them to break the law. Michael, like Raskolnikov, is both studious and in rebellion against study. Books are among his few possessions, but they are gathering dust. Drawing comfort from the philosophy of the Superman, among his books is The Prince of Pickpockets, a study of George Barrington by Richard Lambert, and Barrington was an 18th century pickpocket and author who merits an entry in the mighty Dictionary of National Biography. In this respect, he closely resembles Raskolnikov, also a student in Limbo, to whose philosophy of the right of certain individuals to put themselves above the law Dostoevsky devotes several pages. They form part of the discussions with the police inspector Porfiry Petrovich, whom Raskolnikov regards with suspicion for fear of giving himself away, but to whom he is drawn in order that he might argue in defence of his fury. On his way to see Porfiry with his friend Razumikin, Raskolnikov thinks to himself, is it a good thing I'm going there, or isn't it? The moth flies to the candle flame of its own accord. My heart's thumping, that's the worst of it. Particularly in Dostoevsky's version, the inspector is a secular confessor. For much of the novel, Raskolnikov is on the edge of blurting out to Porfiry what he has done. In American Gigolo, this element of the story has been lost. It is the mechanics of the murder inquiry that pitches Julian into the arms of Sunday, not some inner compulsion. The location of the confessional proves instead to be prison, where in the final image of the film, Michelle Stratton, wishing to touch Julian in compassion, puts her hand on the glass screen that divides them, and Julian leans his head against it. The positioning of Michelle's fingers and Julian's bowed head are a blessing of him by her, priestly in its pose, and signifying the moment of Julian's salvation, his resistance to her love finally overcome. In this final sequence, Schrader seems to copy Pickpocket closely. Michelle Stratton makes 2 visits to Julian in prison, who resists her presence and urges her to forget him. Yet when at the end of the first visit she gets up, he says, "Don't go." At the end of the second, he finally confesses, "My God, Michelle, it's taken me so long to come to you." As he speaks, an electronic version of the slow movement from Mozart's clarinet concerto begins. As the credits come up, we hear an electric guitar taking up the theme from the organ. As an ending, it has the authentic transcendental moment that Schrader identifies in Bresson. Yet there is a dislocation between the two sensibilities. To finish Pickpocket, Bresson uses lullies, baroque violins and trumpets to signal Michel's release from bondage. Schrader no doubt sought similar musical uplift in Mozart, but either he or his producers insisted on it being scored for electric guitar and rock band. That the uplift, therefore, has a tawdry quality is perfectly in keeping with Julian's character. There is another dislocation between the two films. American Gigolo uses professional actors with the necessary theatrical skills, notably Richard Gere as Julian. For Pickpocket, Bresson used non-professionals, and for Michel, the inward Martin Lassalle, gaunt of visage and clothed throughout in the same shabby suit. Surely prompted by the neo-realist films coming out of Italy after the war, featuring ordinary, untrained people from the street, Bresson rigorously excluded trained actors from his films after Journal in 1950 and went on to evolve a polemical aesthetic to justify his approach. In a filmed interview in 1965, he defines film acting as not watching or checking oneself so that words and gestures are spoken and made as if one was an automaton. One glance at a Bresson film shows the effect of the style, and because we are so unused to it, it feels at first quite flat, almost repellent. But he uses it in two particular ways. In the interview he quotes nomically and unexpectedly, "Most great battles are fought at the intersections of military maps." What he is arguing is that the art of cinematography, the word is carefully distinguished from the theatrical art of the cinema, is in making connections, whether between two pieces of film, between sentences of dialogue, between a person's looks and gestures, even between the beginning and end of a shot. That is, the key element is what happens at the edge where the two elements intersect. Whereas dramatic art seals the image so that it can't move, with cinematography, the spectator has to use the imagination to work to create meaning. Furthermore, this austere style is a means to a particular end. Bresson further justifies this flatness as allowing us to see something of the soul, the presence of something superior which is always there, of someone who is God. This works because of his idea about the grace of God working in people. For us to see it, his models, as he called them rather than actors, need to be obedient to a directing style that strips away the accretions of personality so that they become vessels awaiting grace. Michel in Pickpocket is the paradigm. He drifts through the film in a state of self-absorption until the final shot when he finds the capacity in himself to love another, to signal the presence of grace. A third difference between the two films is in the subtle way Bresson uses the soundtrack in this final sequence. In Pickpocket, Jeanne makes two visits to Michel in prison, punctuated by an interval caused by the illness of her child. When she does make a second visit, Michel sees her as transfigured. "Jeanne, what a strange road I had to take to reach you." During the interval of her absence, Michel asks himself, why go on living? In suspense between the heaven of Jeanne's return and the hell of self-damnation. To heighten the moment, Bresson uses the sound of footsteps, as he does in Journal, which we've already examined in chapter 2. Yes. Will they stop outside his door and let him out, or will they go past? One of the reasons prison was such a powerful location for Bresson was that in it sounds becomes more important than sight. More is learnt by listening than seeing. An aesthetic strategy he was to bring into full play in his films in order to nourish the spectator's imagination, especially in A Man Escaped, which will be discussed in chapter 7, which is next week, hopefully. When Michel hears footsteps, they are not just the sound of an approaching guard, but of his destiny. His soul is in jeopardy, a word which derives from the French jeu pâté, a game in which victory and defeat are in balance. When the footsteps finally stop at his door and the key is turned, the audience has its first inkling of the presence of the angel of salvation. Jeanne is not just Michel's confessor, but his intercessor as well. Bresson's films are peopled with young girls taking the high road to damnation, an idea he took from Bananos, but he bestows on Jeanne an innocence, a compassion and a purity of presence that make her a virgin in spirit if not in flesh, like Dostoevsky's Sonia, who while prostituting her body preserves her soul and by it offers salvation to Raskolnikov. All three works of art, while concentrating on the travails of a single figure, suggest a larger social corruption. The cause is money. Bresson is clearest about this. The opening image, after a shot of one of Mikhail's diary entries, is of banknotes being handled at the racecourse, picking up Dostoevsky's idea that Raskolnikov's crime is triggered by the act of pawnbroking, the exchange of goods that impoverishes the customer. Yet it is Schrader who capitalizes on the theme most fully. The first conversation in the film is between Julian and his procuress, Anne, and their argument, which undermines their relationship, is about how much Julian is to receive for the job he is given. Julian, in the best commercial manner, defends his right to a decent monetary stake for performing these sexual exchanges. Later on, it is the question of money that complicates his first encounters with Michelle. One final link is the recurrent idea of a man in his room. Raskolnikov spends long hours in his dirty closet-like flat in St. Petersburg, indifferent to his surroundings, like a prisoner doing time. Mikhail's room is a Parisian version of this cabined existence, a setting which Melville also uses on a slightly grander scale as the home of his samurai gangster, which I believe was last week in The Samurai. Schrader had also depicted Travis Bickle's home in Taxi Driver on the same lines, but for American Gigolo he gives the idea a splendid twist. Julian's apartment is beautifully fitted out, and his clothes, the tools of his trade, are superabundant. As the story develops, the searching of their own private rooms, which obsesses Raskolnikov and Mikhail, in Julian's case is used to mark the turning of his world upside down when the police go through his room. His possessions are tipped and scattered everywhere. It is a crucial stage in stripping Julian of his illusions about the world he inhabits. Pawnbroking, pickpocketing, and prostitution point to an unequal relationship between rich and poor, where those who have not try to take advantage of those who have. Human sin is a deep reflection of human disorder. And next week the subject is oppression, and we'll begin that with, hopefully, from Isaac Watts's hymn, Jesus Shall Reign Where'er the Sun, the prisoner leaps to loose his chains. And the films we'll look at are A Man Escaped, The Army in the Shadows, and Rome, Open City. So, until next week, God willing, as always, may God bless you all. Amen.